Hello and welcome to part 48 of my video series on how to use Blender 2.7. In this video, I'll be showing you how to add decals, graffiti, and dirt to already textured objects. In other words, what we'll be doing here is we'll be adding multiple layers of textures to the same object using the second and third layers alpha channels in order to make different textures layer on top of each other on the same object. For this video, I'm just going to be using the default cube, and to start off with, I'm going to be adding a brick texture that I found at www.cgtextures.com to my default cube. If you want to use this exact texture, you'll find a link to that in the description area below. You do need to sign up for a free membership at www.cgtextures.com, but that's easy to do. And let's go ahead and jump in. I'll click on the splash screen in Blender to get rid of it, and I'll zoom in on my default cube. The first thing I need to do here is I need to make a second UV image editor window in order to unwrap this default cube. So I'll grab this little top crosshatched area and I'll drag it to the left to make a second 3D viewport, but I don't want this to be a 3D viewport. It's going to be a UV image editor window. So I'll click down here on the window type button, and right here the UV image editor. I'll click on that to make this into a UV image editor window. Let's go ahead and unwrap the cube. With it selected, I'll press tab to go into edit mode, and then make sure with AAA that everything is selected, and then I'll press U to bring up my UV mapping menu, and I'll select Smart UV Project. What this will do, unlike unwrap needs to have seams in order to know where to cut up the mesh on its edges, but U and Smart UV Project will automatically find or make essentially seams for me wherever there's an angle of whatever I specify between faces. So U, Smart UV Project, and then I'll just press OK. The angle limit here, wherever it'll make artificial seams, is at 66 degrees. So I'll press OK, and then it's now unwrapped all of these faces into my image mapping area. Okay, let's go ahead and open up a node editor window. I'm actually going to make this side window a little bit narrower. We're not going to use it too much anymore. And I'm going to make another sub window out of this 3D viewport. So I'll grab this little triangle area, drag it down, and change this new window area into a node editor window. This, of course, is where we're going to be adding textures to our cube, and it's going to get pretty crazy with the nodes in here. Of course, if you had not watched my intro to using nodes and adding materials in Blender, I'll put a link to that on the screen right now. I'll also put a link on the screen to my video on UV mapping in Blender Cycle. So there'll be two links on the screen. It's really important that if you don't know how to do either of those things, use nodes or unwrap, in other words, do UV mapping to add an image texture to an object, that you understand both of those things before continuing on with this video, okay? So click those two links if you have not seen those videos yet, then come back to this video. Great, thanks. Let's go ahead and add a material to this object. I'm going to press tab to go back into object mode, and over here in the properties window, I actually already have a material. That's great, but it's not using nodes. It has a material already because this is the default cube. I'll press use nodes though, because I want to see them over here, and here they are now. I've clicked use nodes. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in there. What I want to do here now is import my image texture of the bricks. So with my mouse in this window, I will press Shift A or go to the add menu, and I'll select texture and image texture. We're bringing in a picture of the bricks. So I'll just put the node right there, plug the color output into the input of the diffuse shader right here. Diffuse, of course, just means color. And I'll press open to open up the image texture. And it's on my desktop, and I've got a folder there. And it's called brick small brown 0149_2_s.jpg. I'll click on open image, and we don't see it down here yet because our viewport is in solid shading. It needs to be in material shading for us to actually see the texture. And there it is. Looks pretty good to me. What I might do is just press G and then Z and then 1 and then enter just to move that up onto the ground. Maybe what I'll do now is press Shift A to bring up the add menu. That's Shift A or just the add menu down here. And I'll add a mesh plane. That's a ground. And I'll press S and 10 and enter just to make a ground. So if I go to my camera view, and I go to viewport shading or rendered viewport shading, you can now see what it looks like. And I'll press, maybe go back into material mode, and maybe I'll select the lamp, and I'll just turn it up. I'll click on use nodes and turn it up to 500 just to make it a little bit nicer, so we can see that we have, a scene that looks like it has a brick cube in it and a ground. Great. Let's go ahead and add some graffiti to this brick. So what I'll do here is actually I could go into a separate program like Photoshop or GIMP or Paint.net or Pixelator, any of those photo editing or illustration programs that lets me use layers, and I could paint some graffiti and save that as a PNG image file. Remember that PNGs allow for transparency or alpha channels. If you have not checked out the last video in this series on using image textures with transparency, in which I showed you how to make a leaf texture show up with no white or gray or black box around it, I'll put a link to that on the screen right now. So go ahead and check that out if you haven't seen that already. What we'll be doing here is using the same sort of technique with a little bit, a few extra bells and whistles, in other words, a few nodes up here. So what I want to do here is actually make a new image. I'm not going to use Photoshop, I'm not going to use GIMP. What I'll do here is actually make a new image in my UV image editor window, and then pack it into this Blender file as if it was an image brought in from somewhere else. This UV image editor window allows me to actually make and paint new images. Believe it or not, yes, Blender has that ability. I'm going to click down here on the New button down in the header of this viewport, and it'll allow me to make a new image. Now by default it makes a black image. I don't want that, so I'll click somewhere in the black area, and I'm going to turn the alpha, yes, R for red, green, and blue, and alpha, I'll turn it all the way down to 0. So now we'll get checkerboard, and I'm going to call this CG, because that's what I'm going to do for my graffiti. So I'll press OK, and if I kind of zoom in and out, hopefully, there we go. I'm not sure why it wasn't zooming in and out for me, but here we go. Right now I'm viewing this image, and I can change that down here from view into paint. Yes, Blender has painting ability built in. You'll notice now that there's a circle under my mouse cursor. To just paint with a certain color, I can press T on my keyboard to bring up the tool shelf, or click this little plus, and now I can pick a color to paint with, and I can change what brush. I can use a fill brush, or just a normal draw brush, which is right here, text draw. I can pick the radius of my brush and the strength. So what I'll do here is I'll change my brush to an orange color for CG. Maybe I'll make the brush a little bit bigger, and I'll paint C, maybe a little bit bigger, Control Z, C, G for my channel, born CG. Now I want it to look a little bit more like spray paint, so what I'll actually do is turn the radius up a little bit, and then turn my strength down, and this will make more of like the spray, the fuzziness around my original CG. And I'm not too happy with this, but I'm not going to spend too long for this video. So we have something that looks sort of like spray paint. You know what, I don't like that. I'm going to do it all in one go. There we go. And what I could do is I could switch to my smear brush, and then I could maybe make my radius a lot smaller. And I want to make it look like it was dripping. I could spend some time or dragging that brush down if I want to, but you know what, I'm not going to bother in this video. I think this image is done. Now this image is not saved anywhere. I could save it, I could go to the image menu, and I could save as an image file, but I'm just going to actually pack this image as a PNG file in the Blender file. So it won't actually be anywhere on my computer, it won't be on my desktop, it'll just be part of this Blender file, but Blender will consider it a PNG image file, which will allow it to have transparency. So image pack as PNG, great. I can press this X, it's still in the Blender file, don't worry. Let's go back to our cube with bricks. What I want to do here is make a node setup that allows for a second image texture. So there's my output of my, I've got my lamp selected there. There's the setup for my brick cube. What I want to do here now is bring in a second diffuse image texture. So I'll press Shift A, I'll go to shader, and I'm going to add another diffuse shader here. Of course, if you're thinking we're going to be having to use a mix shader to mix this shader and this shader together, you're absolutely right. So I'll press Shift A, and I'll add a new shader, mix shader, and I'm going to connect the two diffuse, the two inputs here on the mix shader, and then the output to there and there. So I'll drag the output of the first diffuse to the first input, and then that one to that one, and then the output of this one over to my surface, and that'll disconnect the original two. By the way, if you don't know how to disconnect noodles, you can just drag it away, or more fun, hold Control down on your keyboard and draw a knife cut through a noodle. That's Control and then click and drag with your left mouse button. As you can see now, This white diffuse material is now blending with the brick material to make a very washed out looking bricks. That's not what I want. I want to bring in another image. So I'll press Shift A. I'm going to add a texture, an image texture, and I'll input that to the second diffuse shader. By default, Blender, ever since very old versions of Blender, has used this purple or pink color as an image that doesn't actually have an input yet. And now I can click this little picture button and choose the CG picture that's already packed into this Blender file. Okay, so now I've got CG and it's putting it all over the cube, not in the way that I want. What's going on here? Well, if you think back, and I'm going to select the cube and I'm going to press Tab to go into edit mode. Maybe I'll go back into material mode. If I select the cube and press Tab to go into edit mode, we unwrap this cube so that it would fit nicely, or all the faces of the cube would fit nicely inside of my original texture area, the square. Well, if I have a CG picture, I'm actually going to open that up over top of this UV layout. So I'll go down to the picture texture and open up CG. As you can see, that's what it's doing. It's using this texture coordinate, this UV map, with this picture, and it's putting everything as you see it here. So it's not going to fit on one face like I want. How can I solve this? Well, we're actually going to make multiple UV maps for the same object and different images. In other words, this image of the bricks, I'll press N to get rid of that. Maybe I'll make this a little bit bigger so you can see it. This node, or the picture of the bricks, will be using the original UV map, and then this image of the CG will be using the new map that we're going to make in just a sec. How we can make multiple UV maps is over here in the Object Data tab. I don't think I have to be in edit mode of my cube, although it doesn't hurt. Maybe I'll press T to hide that, and maybe I'll go to View and View Selected. My zoom is kind of stuck in there, so View Selected, that'll get your view unstuck so you don't have any problem zooming in or out with that object selected. Under the Object Data tab, in edit mode, at least I am, you can see that there's a bunch of sections when you're in edit mode of a mesh, and one of them is called UV maps, and by default it's using the first one that you made whenever you first started unwrapping this cube. But we can have multiple UV maps. So I'll double click on this name and I'm going to change this to UV, and then bricks. It's important to know what they're named, or at least it's a good habit to. So I'm using capital UV and then lowercase whatever else I'm making. I'm going to make a new UV map, pressing the plus button of course, and then I'll name this one UV CG, CG lowercase, UV uppercase. Okay, so I'm on this one. I'm going to close everything here. I'm going to press this X to get rid of the image. I'll go back into object mode. Actually, what I'll do is I'll go back into edit mode. Yes, whenever you press this plus, it actually uses the original UV map that you had created. So that's why UV CG looks exactly like UV bricks. But what I can do is I can remake seams. I can re-unwrap. I can do UV mapping instead of a Smart UV project. By the way, to orbit or to scroll in here, you just press your middle mouse wheel button down and move your mouse on the side. Just like orbiting in this, you're just orbiting in here essentially. It's kind of weird, but it's how you do it. What I'll do here is I'm going to select one of the sides and I'm going to unwrap that separately. So I'll just select one of the sides of my cube and I'll press U and unwrap. Now what that did is it made that side the entire size of my UV image mapping area. So now you can see I've got a CG on one side. It's kind of the wrong way around, so maybe I'll go in this window and press A and then R 180. Or if I want to have this at a slant, I can just press R and rotate that. Of course, you can select vertices or faces or edges or islands in this area. Of course, you can scroll by orbiting. So maybe what I'll do is I'll have it at a slant. It's up to me and put it up there. But you're probably thinking to yourself, hey, I don't want all of these extra parts from the original UV map, because if I press A and A to select everything in here, I still have this face and this face, all these faces still within that CG area instead of this mapping area, and I don't want that. So what I'll do is I'm going to move them outside of the square. So I'll just select them all in face select mode, press G, move them outside. It's not going to help yet, but we're going to fix that in a second, because what we can actually do is use a few more nodes to specify that this image texture, the CG that's on top of the brick texture, it's going to be using only the UVCG map, and it's not going to allow anything to be outside. It's not going to, in other words, text or repeat or tile the CG over and over and over again all the way outside of the original square. So let's go ahead and set that up. I'm going to go back to my node editor window. In fact, what I'll do is I'll press Control up to make that full screen. And what I'll do now is I'm going to make sure that this image texture uses the right UV map. So I'll press Shift A. I'm going to add a new input node, and that is UV map. This is where we can specify what UV map each image texture is using. So Shift A, input, UV map. I'll click there. I'll attach this vector, the purple little output, to the purple vector input, and this is where I can specify what UV map I'm using here. So I'm going to use UV bricks. Great, I'll do the same thing down here, Shift A, and then input and UV map, click, connect, and for this one I'll use UVCG. Let's go ahead and see what's happening here. It's looking pretty good to me. I've got that CG there, but what about the other parts of the CG that are still overlapping? Even though I have the faces outside of that square, we have to make sure it's not going to use or start tiling that CG all the way outside this area. So to do that, we're going to add one more node. I'm going to make this window full screen actually now. I'll press Control up on my keyboard to make this window full screen. What I have to do here is add a map or mapping node in between this node and this node, the texture of the CG and the texture of the UV map specifying UVCG. So Shift A, and I believe it is in vector and mapping. So Shift A, vector, mapping, and it looks like a big, really intimidating node. But if you think back to my video on image texturing and bump mapping, which I'll put a link to on the screen right now, we actually did use this node when we did not want to use a UV map. You can use texture coordinates instead of a UV map with this same node. In this case, I'm just going to drag it in between these two nodes in the middle of that noodle. It'll auto connect, and I'm just going to have to check here min and max. That's the key here, min and max. We're going to check those two boxes. And now if I go back to take a look at my decal or my graffiti, it looks the way I want it to look. So I've got a CG on one side. Everything is good. Let's go ahead and take all of these nodes, and I'm going to add another whole layer on top to add some dirt to my bricks. So what hopefully you'll be able to do after this video is over is I'm going to be putting the dirt on top of the CG, but I want to see after this video if you guys can add the dirt below the CG and add your own graffiti over top of dirty bricks that you added dirt to on top of clean bricks. Hopefully that makes sense. What I'll be doing here is I've got a second image from cgtextures.com. It's a picture of some moss. It's actually a decal that someone has actually put into the decals category at cgtextures.com. I'll put a link to this exact file or the page for this download in the description area below. Let's go ahead and add that. So I'm going to make this window full screen again, Control up on my keyboard, and I'm going to add a new mix shader. We're going to take all of this stuff. If I press A and A and A just to make sure nothing's selected, and then B for box select, I can take all of that, move it up here. In fact, what I'll do is I'll group these nodes together. They're sort of a self-contained unit. So what I'll do is I'll press Shift A with these nodes selected. Again, if you press B, you'll get up these lines, and you can box select with the B key notes, and then you can go Shift A and group, and I'm going to say make group. What this does, it takes all those selected nodes, it puts them into a group, and then you can press tab just like you're going into edit mode of this new group node, and now you get the original set, and you can modify them inside this group. But again, you can press tab to go outside of that group. It's like editing anything in the 3D viewport, or you can press tab, or you can press this little icon on the corner of the node and you'll open that same thing up. So that's something new for you. I'll press tab again to go back into object mode. I'll make a new mix shader. So Shift A, shader, mix shader. I'll put it right here. We're going to add in now the dirt. So I'm going to add in a new diffuse shader. Shift A, shader, diffuse. Again, diffuse is of course just plain color. I'll plug that into my mix shader, and I'm going to add Shift A texture. I'm going to add an image texture here of that grunge, of that moss from the picture that I just showed you. and I'll put that right there. I'll plug the image texture into the diffuse shader, and I'll open up that image. So open from my computer. I'm going to my desktop. I'm going to the folder where I have that picture. It's called Decal Leaking Mossy 0025_1_s.png. Yes, it's a PNG image file. That means it has transparency built in. So I'll click on Open Image, and what I have to do here is plug in the alpha to the factor of my mix shader. Let's go back and check that out. I'll press Control down arrow on my keyboard, and now you can see that we have dirt over top of the bricks and over top of my spray paint CG. I want to be able to organize this dirt, so what will I do? I'm going to add a new UV map. So under the Object Edit tab with my cube selected, I'll add a new UV map here. Plus, I need to go back to my UV image editor window. I'll press Tab to go into edit mode if you weren't already. I already was. I'll press AA, select all, and then U. And what I'll do here is I'm going to select Smart UV Project again, just to get a nice grid out of that. So U, Smart UV Project, and press OK. Now, the reason why it's stretching these is because the image texture that I just brought in is not a square. It's a big, long rectangle. If I went to U and Unwrap and Smart UV Project, if I did not check correct aspect ratio, it would look good, but then as soon as I brought in that image, so I'll go here, I'll open up my Decal Leaking Mossy picture, and as you can see now, these faces are stretched out. So what I'll do is I'll re-unwrap that, U, Smart UV Project, and click on correct aspect or aspect ratio, and I'll press OK. And now it's actually stretching the squares, but it's making it so that it can consider this large stretched or large rectangular image texture a square, which it kind of needs to do. So what I can do now is hopefully I can grab these different faces and figure out which ones they are and rotate and position the dirt exactly where I want it to be. Of course, I can scale out dirt, but that might not be advisable. Let's go ahead and grab this one. Are any of them attached? I seem to have gotten a bit lucky here. None of them are attaching to each other. So that one's this one. Maybe I'll put that right there. Maybe I'll rotate it R-90 and maybe R-180 because I want the dirt or the moss on top just coming down. Great. Where's my CG face? Let's go for that one. And I want some big dirt over that. R-180, enter. No, that's not quite right. Let's go R. There we go. So R-90. There we go. And I've got some nice moss over top of that. So as you can see, I could go around and select all the faces and position them where I want them to be. I'm just going to do a very quick job. There we go. Alright, so I've actually made a mistake in the last part of this video, so I'm going to be making this new ending to finish off this tutorial. As you can see, I've switched into render viewport shading, so I can take a look at my finished scene with the brick cube with the graffiti and then the moss over the graffiti, but the moss is not positioned correctly over top of the other two layers. What's going on here? Well, I've got a very complicated node set up in my node editor window. What I'll do actually is make the bottom window quite small. In this node editor window, I have 3 image textures that all use UV maps to be positioned on the right parts of this cube in the exact way that I want it. But for the moss layer that I added last, I forgot to add a UV map node. So I'll do that right now. I'll zoom in. Here's the image texture for the moss that I added. Here's the diffuse shader that was plugged into, and of course it mixes up on top of the other 2 things, the bricks and the graffiti, and then here's the final material output. What I have to do though is make sure that it's using, or the moss image texture is using the UV map that I just created. I actually didn't or forgot to name that UV map, so what I'll do is I'll go to my Object Edit tab with the cube selected, and here is my UV map section. This one's just named the default name, UV map, but I'll double click on that and I'll change it to UV moss and press enter. Now, in my node editor window, I'll press Shift A and go to Input, UV map, and then connect that node, of course, the image texture node, and I'll select my UV moss map. You should see right away as soon as I do that, that the moss will change all of its positioning on my brick cube. There it is. That's the result that I want. Alright, so it's done. Let's go ahead and make this window full screen, and I'll make it so you can see all the nodes as big as I can make it right there. And that'll be it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.